We have a quorum, and I call to order the sixth and last session of the fall special town meeting. I have no announcements and will proceed directly with Article 12. The motion on under Article 12 is on page 12-15 over to the top of page 12-16 to accept the Massachusetts Community Preservation Act. Moved by Ms. Hamilton, seconded by Ms. Stamfer. Ms. Hamilton.
Good evening. So before I begin, my name is Heather Hamilton. I'll be for the Select Board as well as the chair of the Land Bank Study Committee. Are my slides ready? Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. In the fall town meeting of 2018, there was a warrant article proposing the creation of a land bank. Its purpose was to help raise funds for the purposes of acquiring property for open space, school space, and affordable housing. The warrant article was referred to a select board committee, and 9 members were appointed to study the question of whether this was feasible and how it might be accomplished. During our study, the committee interviewed a number of experts in real estate, legislation, and other land banks in the state. However, the Community Preservation Act stood out as it was similar in nature to the purpose of the land bank and had been attempted twice before in Brookline, but failed. Last fall, town meeting passed a warrant article that has asked for home rule to levy a transfer tax solely for affordable housing. As a result, the Land Bank Study Committee felt the CPA was the next logical step in addressing the other needs not included in that warrant article. Tonight, town meeting has the opportunity to help us finish an initiative started nearly 20 years ago. In a unanimous vote, the Select Board recommends favorable action. I'm now going to do a presentation that was supposed to be given by David Lescoyer, who is unavailable this evening, and we wish him all the best. I also want to applaud his commitment and his attention to this matter, not only the land bank, but the transfer tax last year. He was invaluable to this work, and we wish him a very speedy recovery. So the first slide says, let's make Brookline next. If you can advance to the next slide. Thank you. The CPA provides participating communities an incentive for additional otherwise unavailable funding dedicated to open space, community housing, and historic preservation. Next slide. Warrant Article 12 is the first step. Favorable action on this warrant article places a question on the ballot in May 2021, asking voters to approve a 1% surcharge on the property tax with an exemption for certain low-income property owners. Once voters approve, then town meeting must enact a CPA committee bylaw. The Select Board must appoint the members of that CPA committee. With the CPA committee in place, the committee may review proposals for CPA funding and recommend to town meeting appropriations for CPA funded proposals. Next slide. The state's CPA trust fund collects a surcharge on county registry of deeds fees. In the first years, the first communities received 100% match. As more communities joined, now 186 communities, the pie has been divided into more smaller slices. As this chart shows, that match has therefore trended down. However, in recent years, while the state has enjoyed budget surpluses, the legislature has used some of this surplus to supplement the registry fees. Based on this, the Land Bank Study Committee had expected that the matching incentive would be approximately 31%. However, after the impact of COVID, there is no longer a state budget surplus. Therefore, the match is currently expected to be only 12%. Next slide. This slide is a schematic of the CPA cash flow. On the left are the two funding sources. Above is the state trust, about $180,000. Below, the Brookline property tax surcharge, roughly $2.3 million. Below is a description of the low-income exemptions expected to benefit approximately 150 households. Next slide. The CPA committee may have up to 9 members. The CPA requires that the committee have Planning Board, Housing Authority, Preservation Commission, Conservation, and Historic Commission members, and up to an additional 4 at-large members. The committee is charged to solicit and make recommendations to town meeting for the appropriation of CPA funds in compliance with the terms and conditions of the CPA statute. Affordable housing funding may be appropriated to the Housing Trust Fund, which is managed by the HAB, the Housing Advisory Board trustees, but only for use allowed by the CPA statute. Next slide. This slide explains allowed uses. At least 10% must be dedicated to housing, open space, and historic preservation. The statute allows up to 5% for administrative support of the CPA committee. The remaining 65% may be distributed among the 4 categories. Next slide. The last slide indicates the estimated impact of the surcharge on property tax bills. Is there an appetite among taxpayers to pay an extra for the betterment of Brookline? Let's hope so. This November, CPA questions were on the ballot in 9 communities, facing the similar fiscal constraints, especially in view of COVID, as Brookline. The questions passed in all 9 by decisive margins. Also, Brookline just passed a debt exclusion to purchase Newbury. In addition to voting for warrant Article 12, please consider joining the effort to inform and persuade voters next May. You can advance to the last slide, and that's my conclusion. Thank you.
Ms. Pelkey?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Linda Pelkey, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2, and a member of the Land Bank Study Committee. I also want to express my deep thanks to David Lescoyer for his in-depth efforts on this warrant article and his passion, and I wish him well. Adopting the CPA is right for Brookline. We've been leaving money on the table for 20 years that could have been used for community enhancing projects. In 2019, Brookline residents paid almost $163,000 in fees at the Registry of Deeds. And last year, that registry fee was doubled, meaning more funds flowing out of Brookline and into the state matching fund. So to date, Brookline has been helping fund CPA projects in all the other CPA communities, which are about 189 right now. Clearly, we have many needs for these funds, which may help offset our growing catalog of necessary capital improvement projects. In terms of open space, our ratio of per capita open space is below national benchmarks for urban communities. And with our rising population, the need for additional park and open space lands will only grow more acute. Recreation, too, is a need. You may recall our town meeting debate over artificial turf at Cypress Field, when we all came to understand the need for additional sports fields and recreation land. The Preservation Commission has articulated some of the ways CPA funds could further their mission to help Brookline retain important properties and historic elements, providing a critical link to our past and preserving a defining aspect of Brookline's character. Affordable housing, too, has only become more of a critical need. One of the striking advantages of becoming a CPA community is having the ability to more quickly respond to opportunities for land purchase, historic preservation, and affordable housing. These funds can be used to leverage grants and avoid borrowing costs and overrides. Growing out of David Lescoyer's Land Bank warrant article, our committee determined that utilizing the existing structure of the CPA with its state matching funds and multi-purpose project eligibility would be the most practical way forward and would best fulfill the original goals articulated for establishing the land bank. In all, it's time for Brookline to join the other enlightened CPA communities. Please vote yes on warrant Article 12. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stanford.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Claire Stamfer, Precinct 5, speaking for the Advisory Committee. And also very appreciative for all the work that David Lescoyer has done for the CPA project. The CPA was approved in Massachusetts in 2000. 176 other communities have accepted it, and now we hear a few more recently. The CPA aims to enable communities to acquire, create, preserve, and, if acquired or created with CPA funds, also to rehabilitate or restore open space, recreation land, and community housing, and to acquire, preserve, rehabilitate, and restore historic resources. Town meeting previously rejected imposing a 3% surcharge to participate in the CPA. The current proposed CPA ballot question would impose only a 1% surcharge. To accept and implement the CPA's local option, Brookline must first have town meeting vote favorable action on this warrant article. Second, voters approve the ballot question. Should the town accept the Community Preservation Act local option at a regularly scheduled town election? Third, town meeting adopts a CPA bylaw. And fourth, the select board appoints a community preservation committee, which must include one representative from each of these town commissions: Conservation, Preservation, Parks and Recreation, Housing Advisory Board, Planning Board, and then up to 4 additional members. 10% of total CPA funds must be allotted to each of open space, historic preservation, and community housing. The allotment of the remainder may be for any or all of the stated purposes as recommended by the committee. All the expenditures recommended by the committee must be appropriated by town meeting. The CPA permits, and this warrant article includes, an exemption for property owners who qualify for low-income housing and low and moderate income senior housing. And the Act mandates exemptions for residents granted the MGL Chapter 59, Section 5 statutory exemptions. Participation in the CPA would allow Brookline to receive matching revenue from the Massachusetts Community Preservation Trust Fund. For the coming fiscal year, it is expected that this fund would distribute a match of between 10 to 12% of what Brookline had raised through the 1% surcharge. Fees collected by registries of deeds on all real estate transactions are the source of funds for the state-level CPA trust fund. Buyers and sellers of parcels in Brookline have been paying into this fund for 20 years, but Brookline has received none of its benefits. Last year, the registry fee surcharge from Brookline's real estate transaction was over $162,000. And effective this January, this surcharge was doubled. Members of the advisory committee supported recommending that Brookline join the CPA because the CPA would allow Brookline to capture additional revenues from the state and have additional revenue to preserve our community. The AC was concerned about the burden on taxpayers. Therefore, the AC had voted an amendment to exempt the first $100,000 of taxable value of residential real estate from the CPA surcharge. On November 16th, this previous vote was reconsidered because the article already exempts low-income taxpayers. By a vote of 12 in favor, 2 opposed, and 12 abstentions, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on Article 12 as submitted by the Land Bank Study Committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Elperin? Elperin. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Elton Elperin from Precinct 1, and I'm currently chair of the Preservation Commission. The commission supports Article 12 and has voted to approve the following statement of support. This opportunity seems exactly designed for the work we do. From our point of view, the possibility of securing funds for the preservation of our historic buildings and site elements with a matching grant from the state is one we shouldn't pass up. We see the opportunity to coordinate with other town efforts such as affordable housing projects to preserve elements like slate roofs and ornamental detail that might otherwise be sacrificed for the sake of economy, or to restore historic town properties as been partially done at the Brookline Reservoir Gatehouse, for example, bringing them back to public use. Apart from building projects, the Preservation Commission needs additional funds to digitize its large and valuable collection of photographs and drawings. With the additional funding, it could employ staff to apply for national register status of individual properties and neighborhoods that have already been surveyed, expanding a pool of properties that has not increased since 1985. And so adding leverage for historic preservation through the 18-month demolition delay. By participating in the CPA, we'll be joining with nearly 200 other Massachusetts cities and towns that have already taken advantage of this resource to support historical preservation projects, ranging from surveys of Newton's early architectural buildings to restoring 42 original wood windows in Concord's Umbrella Community Arts Center. In sum, the funds obtained through the CPA could support a great range of valuable work. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nobrega?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Mariah Nobrega, Town Meeting Member Precinct 4, speaking on behalf of the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. The CDICR unanimously supported favorable action on Warrant Article 12. The Warrant Article 12 would ask the town to accept the CPA. Acceptance of the CPA would allow the town to receive matching funds from the state for several uses, including affordable housing. The CDICR is very focused on affordable housing and is very supportive of this warrant article. Therefore, we urge you to join us in voting yes on Warrant Article 12. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hyken?
For the planning board. I won't repeat some of the reasons that the Community Preservation Act has been supported by the other boards you've heard from and what it can be used for. But I just would stress that this is the third time that the opportunity to adopt the CPA has come before town meeting. In the two previous instances, the proposed surcharge was the maximum 3%, and the effort failed to gain approval. Currently, 16 of the 28 communities in Norfolk County have adopted the CPA, among 176 communities statewide, which are half of the municipalities in the state. All of our neighboring and peer communities, Boston, Newton, Cambridge, Somerville, Wellesley, Needham, Arlington, Belmont, and Watertown have adopted the CPA. Currently, Brookline contributes the third largest amount of any community in Norfolk County to the CPA fund from fees on real estate transactions. That was $162,000 last year. and gets none of it back. These fees are redistributed along with the state match to the communities that have adopted the CPA. It is long past time that Brookline joined with its peers and adopted the CPA, which will provide much needed funding for worthwhile projects related to open space and recreation, historic preservation, and affordable housing. Had Brookline adopted the CPA 10 years ago, it is likely that the town's proceeds from CPA would have exceeded $30 million by now. The Planning Board thus strongly recommends favorable action on warrant Article 12. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schweitzer? Ms. Schweitzer? Here we are.
Good evening, Naomi Switzer, Precinct 10. I'm going to yield my time to the next speakers.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson? Yes.
I speak for myself and for the Brookline Green Space Alliance in support of this warrant article. The
Please tell
Brookline
us
Green
who you
Space,
are.
Anita Johnson, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 8, and
Thank
Vice
you.
President of the Brookline Green Space Alliance. The Brookline Green Space Alliance is a land-based environmental organization dedicated to the care and enhancement of parks and open spaces in Brookline. The CPA will provide additional funding, as you know, both local and state, for our green spaces. We so value these spaces, and they have become ever more important during this pandemic times. Our neighboring towns have made great use of CPA funds for green spaces. Cambridge, as you know, adopted a 3% CPA tax and has received $190 million for CPA projects and have devoted $20 million to open space projects, such as shoreline improvements at Magazine Beach, and most of you know these sites. Its parks projects include creation of a number of pocket parks and dog parks, ecological landscaping at Fresh Pond, restoration at Kingsley Point Park, and construction of a number of playgrounds such as the Cambridge Port Playground. Our neighbor, the city of Newton, has adopted a 1% CPA and has devoted $36 million to green spaces within its borders. Examples are it has acquired 17 acres adjacent to its Hammond Park conservation land. It has acquired 21 acres adjacent to its Kessler Woods Park. It has purchased its last surviving farm, which is now a community farm and farm share program. It has created a new playground and recreational space at Newton Highlands Park. It has created public paths, boardwalks, and other improvements at Crystal Lake Park, Wellington Park, and Newton Center Playground. Our neighboring cities show us what Brookline can do if warrant Article 12 is passed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Yassin?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Martin Yassin, Precinct 2. It's the first time I've had an opportunity to speak at a town meeting. And I was reading over the Article 2, and all of the goals that people have described are of course, indisputably worthy goals. And I very much appreciate the comments that have been made about not leaving the money on the table. What bothers me about this situation is, or this article, is that from my understanding, about 45% of the households in Brookline are renters. Now, the surcharge on the property taxes is something that is across the board, except for the exemptions that have been made. Well, it seems to me that really there's a certain kind of an inequity here, because all of the things that these funds would be used for would increase the attractiveness and ambience of the town of Brookline. And that in turn would increase the property values of the property owners of Brookline. And these properties are escalating quite rapidly. But the renters, who presumably are here because they can't actually afford to buy a house in Brookline, they would also bear this same 1% if their landlords, as might be expected, are going to pass the 1% on to them. So in effect, the homeowners have a great benefit from this, though they, on the front end, they're paying something greater in their property tax. On the other end, they're seeing a great rise in their home values. Thank you, sir. Whereas the renters, they might have a nicer community, but they are simply paying more for their apartments if their landlords choose to raise their rents. So I don't know if it's possible, because I don't know enough about the intricacies of these things, but I wonder if it's not possible to change the formula so that property owners would pay more surtax and the rental properties would have less surtax, so that it would more equalize the benefit overall of this surtax to the town as a whole. And we're always speaking of the town as a whole, but it would be nice if in fact the interest of the whole town as a whole were taken as a whole, including those 45% of the households who are renters. I don't know how this could be accomplished, but this is my concern in looking at this article. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It probably cannot be accomplished because the law provides that the CPA is funded with 1% of the actual property taxes paid by the owners. Mr. Friedman?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Harry Friedman, Precinct 12. The CPA imposes a relatively modest addition to our property taxes. However, I think it's important to at least know what those taxes look like. And so I have one question, and then I probably have a follow-up question. My first question is, am I correct in understanding that for the current fiscal year, when we get the tax bills that are no longer estimated tax bills, that the median single-family home in Brookline will see a tax increase this year of between 10.1 and 10.8%? And I believe Ms. Franconi may.
Yeah, Ms. Franconi?
Good evening, Gina Franconi, Finance Director. Mr. Friedman is correct that a single-family homeowner's actual tax bills for Q3 due February 1st and Q4 due May 3rd will increase between 10.1% and 10.8%. 5.5% of this increase is due to the debt exclusion for the high school. The Select Board held its tax classification hearing this past Tuesday, and they will vote on the tax rate next Tuesday, December 8th.
Thank you. You have another question, Mr. Friedman?
Yes. Am I also correct in assuming that these tax bills, which will be sent out, will not reflect the Driscoll School, the 32 million we voted for the high school, or anything we may do in the future on the Davis footpath, the Pierce School, the firehouses, or any kind of operating override?
Ms. Franconi?
Mr. Friedman is also correct in his list of potential projects. I would also add the Fisher Avenue parcels to his list.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, Ms. Franconi.
Thank you, Ms. Vogt. VOGT.
Hello, my name is Marissa Vogt, and I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 4. I had a question. I was wondering if you could discuss the expected financial impact of the CPA surcharge on renters, especially low-income renters, since I understand there's a exemption for low-income property owners. I ask this question because I realize that renters do not directly receive a property tax bill from the town, although property taxes are paid on their behalf. And if you can't answer that question, perhaps maybe you could help us understand what fraction of residential property taxes overall by the town are currently paid by renters versus property owners. Thank you.
Ms. Hamilton, can you respond to that?
I think I can try to respond to the first question, but I might call on staff to assist for the second question. The first question is whether or not there are exemptions for renters. Sadly, there really are not, at least not in state law. That is something that we could maybe put a study committee to try to look at, but it would be very difficult to try to weed into the relationship between a landlord and a rentee. I'm not exactly sure what legal footing we would have and what enforcement mechanisms would be at our disposal.
Do you have any suggestions for the other question?
If Ms. Franconi has those numbers about
Ms.
the
Franconi?
rough breakdown.
I'm sorry, can the question be repeated?
Yeah, Ms. Vogt, what's your other question?
Yes, I was wondering if you could just give us a rough estimate of what fraction of the overall residential property taxes are paid by property owners versus paid on behalf of renters.
Well, maybe the question is what percentage of the town housing stock is rental property?
Well, I don't think that's quite the same because rental property is taxed at a different rate than owner-occupied property.
Well, why don't I let the expert try to respond to you?
So
Thank you.
apartment complexes are also taxed at the same rate as a residential unit. So it's the same.
That's what I thought. Ms. Park?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Yeah, I was just wondering.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. Susan Park, town meeting member, precinct 2. It's interesting that this warrant article was voted down twice already. So I'm wondering if two experts could tell us some reasons why it could have been voted down in the past. Like, what are the cons?
I think the main problem was a 3% surcharge on the taxes, on real estate taxes. That at least was what I recall of the CPA battles of the past. Anyone have any other insights? Ms. Hamilton?
The moderator is correct. When we interviewed people associated with the CPA, both on the pro side and on the con side, a lot of people said that upon reflection, 3% was probably a little too ambitious. And then the exchange that you just saw between town meeting member Friedman, we do have some overrides. We've had some overrides that are going to hit. We will continue to have some other operating as well as debt exclusion overrides. And, every single time we're asking the exact same pocket of taxpayers to come up with, more money. This one is modest by most standards, but, they eventually do lead to higher taxes for all.
Thank you, Ms. Mautner.
I yield my time. I yield. It's been answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bernard.
Lauren Bernard, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 8. I wanted to follow up on what Marissa Vogt had said from Precinct 4. I think there's, I don't know if it's an elephant in the room, but it's certainly something that hasn't been stated clearly, is that, yes, these apartment complexes may be taxed the same, but for owners, there's this residential exemption. And I think that's not a negligible point. So I don't think it's really a fair comparison. When we talk about people who rent, they have to absorb extra expenses to sort of bail out the people who own their units, and they don't get the benefit of a residential exemption. It's up to the owner whether to accord them some kind of relief based on his or her residential exemption. So I just wanted to make that point. And to a second point, if I may, following up on Select Board Member Hamilton's point is, we're constantly tapping the same subset of people, property owners. The only answer there is to stimulate commercial tax growth. And, it would be nice to see some concerted efforts in this regard. That's really all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jora Gorfain.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. First of all, please, it's Giora Gorfine. And I wanted to follow up on Ms. Bernard already addressed this about the residential exemption, but I did want to follow up to repeat Ms. Voigt's question, which is, what is the relative percentage of the tax revenue from residential property that we receive that comes from rental property versus from owner-occupied property?
Okay, Ms. Franconi, can you respond to that? It's a pretty specific question.
I don't have that information in front of me. I'm happy to run the numbers, but I believe on the slide from Select Board Hamilton that it was, the 1% was $135 on a single family. I also want to-
that wasn't my question.
I know, I'm just trying and calculate in my head as I'm talking here, but I also want to say that 80% of the CPA can be dedicated to affordable housing. This isn't just for recreation and open space, that our neighbors have done a fabulous job in putting money towards affordable housing projects as well.
Thank you, Ms. Jazwicki.
I am an owner-occupied landlord,
And who are you?
I'm Joyce Jazwicki, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 9. My lease clearly states that I can raise their rent 60% because they live in 60% of the livable space of my tax increase. So renters, and I'm sure other landlords do this too, renters are paying their fair share.
Mr. Ridreo, Ridruejo.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I had a question for Ms. Franconi the other day at the Select Board when they were discussing the tax exemption. It was mentioned, and I wanted to see if you could verify this. It was mentioned that if the owner of a building, a rental building, lives in the unit or in the building, that all the units in that building are exempt. Is that correct?
They receive the residential exemption, yes.
So if there's 100 units in a building and the owner, and it's owned by a single person rather than a corporation, that person lives in that building, 100 of those units are exempt.
The owner receives the residential exemption.
So not the other units. Or
That's correct. Mr. Gay-Such? Gayshock?
Yep, nope, no problem. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dave Gayshock, Precinct 13. Another question for Ms. Franconi, and with apologies that I did not give her the courtesy of prompting her for it. So thank you for her indulgence. Ms. Franconi, is it also true that as a percentage of property value and therefore presumably resale value, that Brookline homeowners are paying something on the order of maybe half to 60% in tax bills of what we were 20 years ago? So are rates down from somewhere in the 16s to somewhere in the $9+ range, and that's before the impact of residential exemption?
I would say you would probably be pretty close. Our assessed values are increasing. I believe they increased between 5 and 6% this year, and that they're just appreciating. It's really remarkable. Even in this time, we're seeing that the housing market is not declining in its assessed values, and the sales. The prices of the homes selling in Brookline are astounding.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levy.
Hello, I'm Mark Levy. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 7. And I want to add one thing to this discussion, which is that a lot of the reason why single-family homeowners are getting a very large share of any increase over time in property taxes is because their values have historically increased much more rapidly than other classes of homeowners. And many of them are at some point, well, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are at a point where they're past the break-even point on the residential exemption, and the increased residential tax rate that results costs them more than it saves them because of the residential exemption. The question to ask, I think, is always not what is the nominal tax rate on residential property, but what is the effective tax rate? If someone has a condo for $400,000 and they get I have no idea yet what they've decided on for the residential exemption this year, but let's say $350,000, they're going to be paid $15 and change or something like that on $50,000. If someone has $1 million property and it's the same $350,000, they're going to pay 15.7% or whatever that turns out to be this year on $750,000. So the more expensive the home, the more effective your effective tax rate is. And in terms of residential exemptions on owner-occupied buildings, there's one tax bill on a building and one exemption on a building. So if someone lives in a 3-family home and they rent out two floors, you get one tax bill and they get the residential exemption on the entire value of the building. There's
1 minute.
There's still one tax bill. They get one residential exemption if the owner lives there. And the effect on each of the 100 units is de minimis, which it means in Latin, it's too small for me to figure out. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Lepson. You've been unmuted, so.
Yes, and I'm just getting it together here. So thank you. Robert Lepson, Precinct 9. Thank you. I just wanted to put things into perspective just a touch here. I am absolutely voting in favor of the CPA. I was on the Land Bank Committee and support this warrant article 100%. I live in North Brookline on Thorndike Street, single family home, probably slightly above the median value here in town based on what I'm hearing and what I read on Zillow. I have no idea what my house is actually worth, but I just did a back of the envelope calculation, and this is kind of in response to what Harry Friedman had said earlier. The extra cost, property tax, I still have a mortgage, so my taxes are escrowed. So I think in terms of monthly amounts, the CPA would add about $16 to my tax bill on a monthly basis. So relatively modest in the grand scheme of things. Certainly the 10.8% that Harry was referring to earlier is substantially greater than that, but this extra 1% is almost, is quite modest. Thank you.
Thank you. No more speakers, and we will proceed to a vote on the main motion on page 12-15 to accept the Community Preservation Act. Yes. Okay, the voting period has commenced. Please make sure you cast your votes thoughtfully and correctly, because you will not have an opportunity to revisit how your votes have been recorded, assuming that we manage to get through the rest of our business this evening. Voting period has lapsed. Mr. Jones?
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
Anyone else on the phones? What's the count?
207 yes, 7 no, 6 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 209 in favor, 7 opposed, and 6 abstentions. We now proceed to Article 27. And the situation under Article 27 is a little bit complicated because there are no less than 2 referral motions being offered. So to cover the full panoply of the motions, the main motion is on page 27-4, moved by Ms. Hamilton, seconded by Ms. Schatz, to amend the zoning bylaw as indicated in the grid on page 27-4 relating to micro units. Yes, Ms. Gorfine.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I believe that when we voted to defer Article 27, we also voted to take up Article 34 before Article 27.
No, I was incorrect about that.
Well, that was what the motion was that we voted on. And we did vote.
We're taking Article 27, Ms. Ma'am.
So we're disregarding the earlier vote of town meeting?
That was my interpretation. It was not a part of the motion. The motion was to defer Article 27 to this evening.
That was not what I recall voting on.
Okay. So it's moved by Ms. Hamilton, seconded by Ms. Schatz. There is an amendment on page 27-8 that's moved by Mr. Selwyn, seconded by Mr. Sandman. Of more immediate relevance, there are 2 motions to refer. One offered by Ms. Pelkey and seconded by Mr. Margolis to refer the subject of matter of Article 27 and related matters to a select board appointed Planning and Zoning Oversight Committee. That motion is found on page 1 of supplement number 2. The second motion to refer is on supplement number 3, moved by Mr. Dempsey and seconded by, is there a second? Seconded by Ms. Hamilton, that the subject matter of Article 27 solely, that subject matter, be referred to the Planning Department for development of a revised warrant article to be considered at the 2021 annual meeting. The difference between the two referral motions is in the scope of the scope of the Pelkey motion, which I'll refer to as the Pelkey motion, is considerably greater than that of the Dempsey motion, and the referral itself is different. As you will hear from the extensive list of speakers I have on each side, and we're going to deal first with the referral motions. What this means in terms of your remarks is that we will not get into a detailed analysis of micro units and what the main motion refers to and what micro units, how they intersect with the zoning bylaw. We will focus on the referral motions, and of course you have to know something about what the subject matter is, and you'll hear something about it, but I want to limit this to strictly a consideration of the relative merits of the two referral motions. With that in mind, I call on Ms. Pelkey.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Linda Olson Pelkey, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2. In my career as an urban planner, I've always worked for the public sector, and I consider myself a public servant first and foremost. Planners who work for private developers have a completely different point of view. It's been a privilege to be a part of many of Brookline's recent planning and zoning efforts, and I hope that explains something about why I'm here before you tonight. I'm sounding the alarm. Brookline is at a crossroads. Article 27 is the first of a string of several significant zoning changes being put forward by various advocacy groups and constituency, such as eliminating residential parking requirements, using zoning to incentivize fossil fuel-free construction, increasing our housing supply, eliminating single-family zoning, or significantly upzoning Boylston, Harvard, and Beacon Streets. These proposals are all unavoidably interrelated, which is why we are moving to also refer Article 34 to the same Select Board Planning and Zoning Oversight Committee. For decades, we have successfully taken on planning and zoning for bite-sized areas, focusing especially on commercial development. Each special zoning overlay committee took an in-depth look at context, setting, and impacts, all the while securing for the town significant developer contributions for local area infrastructure, tax certainty, and other public benefits. This is the exact opposite of wide-scale by right expansion of our zoning. Recent focus on major zoning reform has revealed our vulnerabilities. Proactively upzoning would eliminate the process of negotiating with project proponents. The planning department is already doing some useful studies on discrete topics, and that work should continue. They will be a great start for the oversight committee, but we need to comprehensively consider all of these initiatives, which is what the Pelkey-Margolis referral would do. It's time to get serious about articulating a vision for our future as a community, and to do the work to understand the trade-offs, impacts, and consequences of the various paths we may take. That's what this proposal is all about. We need to collectively set priorities, and perhaps most importantly, we need to have the necessary conversations in the wider community so we can move forward together. After all, we are talking about major impacts to Brookline's quality of life, character, town budget, and individuals' property values and property rights. The Pelkey-Margolis motion allows for this necessary community dialogue. Micro units, because the rent per square foot is much higher than for larger units, are more profitable for developers. Coupled with elimination of parking requirements, we could be triggering demolition of our older, more affordable housing stock and local business areas, causing widespread displacement. The Dempsey motion assumes that the only relevant issue is a technical drafting one. We disagree. There are many complexities to microunits we may want to tailor to our specific goals, such as where microunits make sense. Should they have a minimum size standard? Should the FAR be reduced? Do we want to require shared common spaces, etc.? With referral to the Oversight Committee, we could improve upon the broad brush proposal and instead get what we want. We've heard that we don't have time and this proposal is only a way to stall. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the Pelkey-Margolis motion is a direct response to these zoning change initiatives. We are proposing a process and mechanism to answer the questions raised by warrant articles 24 and 34 and 27 in a timely, productive, and inclusive way. We're proposing that we get started right away doing the analysis that is necessary to make good decisions and access some of the state-of-the-art zoning techniques any forward-looking community needs, all the while initiating a wider public dialogue. A new public-facing committee is the only way to do that. Our zoning bylaw has not been comprehensively updated for more than 50 years. Please vote to put the town in the driver's seat, not the developers. Vote to understand our choices. Vote to start an inclusive public dialogue, and vote to acknowledge that we need to get this right. Please vote for the Pelkey-Margolis motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zurab.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I don't need the slides. Thank you, though. Good evening. My name is Michael Zurab. I live in Precinct 3 in a small apartment, a 361 square foot studio, or a so-called micro unit. Warrant Article 27 intended to restore small apartments like mine as a legal use in Brookline, where hundreds of such units already exist and were legal to build for more than a century until they were inadvertently banned as part of the Emerald Isle rezoning in late 2016. On Saturday, a careful town meeting member pointed out a technical issue with Warrant Article 27. We had an amendment to address the concern, but it was ruled out of scope, and so we now support a motion to refer. Of the motions before you, I ask that you support the Dempsey motion because it creates a timely process for addressing the issue of this warrant article. It does so by referring microunits to the planning department to submit a revised article at the next town meeting. Staff from the department's regulatory division have told me that this timeline is feasible and not overly burdensome. Hence, the Dempsey amendment will enable town meeting to address the inadvertent ban on small apartments by May. On the other hand, the Pelkey motion has no deadline for ever bringing back a warrant article about microunits. Select Board Member Van Scoyet pointed out last night that town meeting is best suited to address predetermined and thoroughly vetted questions. But the Pelkey motion, filed between day 3 and day 4 of town meeting, is an entirely new proposition and separate from microunits. It creates a new Select Board Planning and Zoning Oversight Committee, not to be confused with the existing Select Board Zoning Bylaw Committee, to examine everything from the land use implications of COVID to, quote, housing generally. It charges this new committee to spend, quote, such funds as shall be necessary to complete a comprehensive plan update and zoning review process. And it does so without buy-in from either the Select Board, which voted to endorse the Dempsey amendment, or the Planning Department, whose director told me that while she appreciates the intent of the motion, she considers its proposed committee unnecessary, duplicative, and overly burdensome on staff resources. I'm disappointed that my first speech at town meeting asked you to delay a warrant article that I worked hard on. But looking to the future, the Dempsey motion charts a better path. It addresses the issue at hand and complements rather than disrupts ongoing planning initiatives like the Housing Production Plan and Multifamily Housing Study. For these reasons, I ask you to please first vote no action on the Pelkey-Margolis motion and then vote favorable action on the Dempsey motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Selwyn.
Thank you. Lee Selwyn, Town Meeting Member Precinct 13, speaking for the Advisory Committee, which by a vote of 26-1 with no abstentions supports overwhelmingly the Pelkey-Margolis referral. Article 27 is an example of the interconnectedness and risk of rushing into individual zoning measures without addressing things more comprehensively. The reason that the proponents of Article 27 filed their petition in large part was because the implications of a prior zoning initiative, the Emerald Island, ignored the fact that one of the things it was accomplishing was to make the small units, which had been allowed by right in Brookline, non-conforming. And I want to emphasize that word non-conforming. It did not make existing small units illegal. It made them non-conforming, which is something that happens when zoning changes and pre-existing units no longer conform to the revised zoning. The proponents also failed to recognize when they filed their original proposal the technical problem that Dick Benka identified with respect to the impact on commercial buildings in terms of the amount of space along the street that could be devoted to non-commercial activity. What the Pelkey amendment or the Pelkey referral would do is to address issues like this comprehensively. The claim is being made that this is simply a way of deferring microunits. That's not really accurate. First of all, microunits are not economical to build unless they also get their the other component of the original warrant article, which was the elimination of parking minimums in these buildings. No one's going to build a building with 500 square foot apartments and another 350 square feet for parking space. Parking is integral to the economics of microunits, and yet it's not up for discussion now because it was withdrawn by the petitioners. The parking issue will have to be addressed, not in the context just of microunits, but in the context of a larger parking reexamination, which has already occurred several times in the last 8 or 10 years at town meeting.
1 minute.
The purpose of trying to address issues comprehensively is to avoid these kinds of technical problems. Unless parking is addressed, microunits are not economic. And if parking is eliminated from microunits, it will create a very perverse incentive for developers to basically eliminate their plans for a more diverse type of development and focus instead on these very highly profitable small units. It's a major problem that has to be addressed comprehensively and not piecemeal. And the Pelkey proposal accomplishes that. Please vote favorable action on the Pelkey referral proposal and no action on the Dempsey proposal. Thank you.
Just to clarify, we'll vote first on the Pelkey referral motion. If it receives a majority approval of town meeting, then we will go on to the next warrant article. If it fails, we will then vote on the Dempsey referral motion. If that fails, we'll proceed to the main motion and the amendment. Mr. Dempsey.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Chris Dempsey, town meeting member from Precinct 6. I'm also the chair of the Transportation Board, but am not speaking on its behalf. In fact, my friend and colleague on the board, Linda Olson-Pelkey, offers the rival motion tonight. Linda and I have traded some collegial emails on this topic and agreed that whatever happens, it will not get in the way of our friendship and partnership on so many other areas of town policy. I'm speaking tonight from what others may call a microunit, but what I just call home. That's right, I live happily in a 450 square foot apartment in the heart of Brookline Village. In fact, ever since I learned that the River Road Study Committee inadvertently made homes like mine illegal, I have feared a knock on the door from the building commissioner, handing me a notice that I must add a 51 square foot addition to my apartment to bring it into compliance, or else I might be hauled off to zoning jail. But all joking aside, I believe my building is an asset to Brookline Village and the town as a whole. Micro units are not some new alien structure that would be dropped into Brookline like a monolith in the Utah desert. My building has been here since 1910 and contributing tax revenue that entire time, $26,000 in FY21, and with no children added to the schools. If that doesn't sound like a lot of money, consider that my landlord pays 12 times the amount of tax revenue that Bob Kraft pays on a square foot basis, 12 times. Now my building is currently home to the Framers Workshop on the first floor, a wonderful, unique, vibrant small business. The people who live in my 4-unit building are young professionals and graduate students in a phase of their life where a smaller apartment makes sense. Now, maybe that's not your cup of tea today, but it might have been in the past and it might be in the future when downsizing to a home which requires less maintenance could hold a lot of appeal. In my case, the benefit of a smaller apartment is that I can save up for a down payment on a home in Brookline without having to live with roommates. Roommates were cool in my 20s, much less so in my 30s. So this is not capital A affordable housing, but it is lowercase a affordable housing for people like me who grew up in and are deeply rooted in Brookline and need to find affordable ways to live if we want to stay here. Would you like some more evidence that buildings like mine can play that role? Many years ago, my very building was home to another youngish town meeting member who wanted to save for a foothold in Brookline. You now know him as Town Clerk Pat Ward. So I would suggest that smaller homes can add to the diversity of Brookline's housing stock and help keep Brookline such a special place to live. But we're not actually here tonight to debate whether homes like mine are good or bad for Brookline. Even those who are skeptical of smaller homes should support the Dempsey motion because it's the one that best prepares town meeting to have a full and proper debate about the pros and cons of this particular building form. The Dempsey motion allows the planning department to make the technical changes needed to address legitimate drafting concerns, and then let's return in May to have a big debate about small units. Please join me in a strong coalition of diverse town meeting members, from Deborah Brown to Paul Sainer to Mariah Nobrega to Cliff Brown and many, many more, in voting no on the Pelkey motion to refer and then yes on the Dempsey motion to refer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Benka.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Dick Benka, supporting the broader Pelkey motion to refer Article 27. Common sense says that we should not be doing zoning in piecemeal fashion, and warrant Article 27 demonstrates the problem. A proposed change to one section of the bylaw dealing with micro units could have affected the vitality of all our commercial districts. And what sort of micro units do we want? Do we want a mix of small and large units in our buildings as we've had historically? Or do we want entire buildings filled with micro units? Now, some say the market won't support that in Brookline, but it is what Article 27 would allow. Language can be drafted to allow either outcome or something in between, but defining the desired outcome merits a broader discussion and not just a 1-hour debate at the next town meeting. Going further, provisions in the zoning bylaw are intertwined with even broader policy issues. Deborah Brown forwarded a very helpful link to an eye-opening study of microunits by the Urban Land Institute. The buildings often include energy-using spaces to enhance marketability: club rooms, cyber cafes, fitness centers, and pools. Rents per square foot are significantly higher than for traditional apartments. And the target market? Young, more often than not male, single, transient professionals. Hardly a recipe for affordability and diversity. These issues should be part of the public discussion. The Pelkey motion to refer Article 27 contemplates this systematic, comprehensive public process. Does it ask for too much public process? I don't believe so. Interim housing policy decisions or zoning changes are not precluded. The Select Board appoints the committee, and the Select Board can define its role and set its priorities.
1 minute.
It can set interim goals and deadlines. It can accelerate issues. It can even modify the committee's charge on an ongoing basis. Fundamentally, changes in our zoning bylaw should not be driven by happenstance. The determinant should not be whether an idea was the first to be brought to town meeting. It should be what ideas will work best. And that's why I favor the more comprehensive referral motion for Article 27, rather than a narrow referral to a town department of a single zoning proposal considered in isolation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton.
Heather Hamilton for a unanimous select board. There are 2 motions to refer. One motion is to refer this matter to the planning department with a deadline to report back in 2021. The other motion is to refer to a select board committee to be appointed by the select board and a broader scope than just micro units. There was a lot of discussion around the pros and cons of both proposals, but in the end, we were persuaded that the planning department staff is in the best position to review and edit the proposal for micro units and to report back to town meeting. Appointing another study committee will result in a longer process. Please vote favorable action on the Dempsey motion to refer to the planning department. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Margolis.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. John Margolis, Precinct 7. You know, buildings last a long time. When a zoning change encourages a certain type of building, the block, the street, the neighborhood will be affected for 30 or 40 years, maybe more. So it's important to get it right. Our motion recognizes that Article 27 expresses policy. Actually, it expresses a number of them. The discussion of the article before tonight revealed that those policy implications were not fully recognized when it was written. Fair enough. We move for referral to give an opportunity to consider what the policies are that should be involved with this zoning change and others perhaps, and what those changes should be. We propose a referral to a committee to be established by the select board because questions of policy should be developed by a committee that includes citizens. The competing motion would send Article 27 to the planning department. The department is excellent, but it is not the place to make policy on matters that will affect everyday life in our neighborhoods for decades to come. That should be the responsibility of the citizens. And revising the article and bringing it back to town meeting in the spring is not going to prepare us and permit us the range of debate that should be involved in developing a good policy response. Some of the policy questions that the article presents are, how many micro units should be permitted in a building? Do we want entire buildings composed only of micro units? Should we perhaps allow smaller buildings to be all micro units, but limit the number of larger structures? The choice could have very real effects on our streets and neighborhoods. Think of the difference between a building of 60 micro units and one on the same footprint with 15 micro units and 25 2 or 3 bedroom apartments. Which would you want on your street?
1 minute.
Also, thank you. Also, do we want to encourage micro units in the already most crowded areas of the town, or would it be better to distribute density more widely? Again, the answers to these questions could have very long-lasting and important effects. We do not pretend to know what the policies of this article should further, but we do suggest that the citizens of the town should take a good look at the choices before we decide. That's why we urge you to vote favorable action on the Pelkey motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blood.
Let me get my, am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
I'm Roger Blood, Chair of the Town's Housing Advisory Board. The HAB had a public hearing on Article 27 and voted in favor of the underlying article that would fix what was basically an error with unintended consequences that you've heard about in the River Road zoning overlay. And so from that favorable vote, and the HAB has taken a position to encourage micro units as part of larger, broader ability to produce and meet the town's housing needs. There is an existing housing production plan from 2016 that we are just beginning the process of renewing and expanding and updating. But that's the current operative document for housing policy in town, and it has an explicit reference to the encouragement of micro units in Brookline. None of that is to say that there is some major effort to expand what was the status quo before this mistake was made on River Road. This is essentially an article to restore, and I'm speaking in favor of the Dempsey, the very simple Dempsey article, which is a technical fix that the planning department is fully capable of doing in a reasonable time, rather than a more global study of everything to do with zoning and land use in the town for the sake of restoring the ability of what existed for many years in the authorization of micro units. The fact is, whatever may be imagined, that micro units may be allowed to overrun the town and change entire neighborhoods. There have only been 2 proposals for micro units in town in the last decade. And neither of them were particularly controversial from the standpoint of meeting.
1 minute.
Yeah, I will do that. The fact is that just this simple restoration of the ability to include micro units in other proposed projects, pending any kind of larger planning effort, will not have the effect of large-scale development of micro units, because our existing zoning limits, FAR, et cetera, in our multifamily districts are quite restrictive, so that any significant type of micro unit proposal would require zoning relief no matter what. And so I think that the much broader concerns that have been expressed by Ms. Pelkey and others relating to other new zoning initiatives or parking are being projected onto something here, which is a rather limited technical issue that should be fixed and in a timely way, and not remain an impediment to this kind of housing in every respect for a year or more. So I would urge that the town meeting approve the Dempsey amendment and do this fix, and also conduct broader planning as needed, as described by Ms. Pelkey over time.
Thank you, Mr. Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Paul Warren, Precinct 1. On the surface, Articles 27 and 34 seem very different. Article 27 is a zoning bylaw change, and Article 34 is a resolution. What these two articles have in common is that they are asking you to sign up for possibly thousands of additional housing units without the benefit of knowing the impact that such a decision will have on our business and residential districts, green spaces, transportation system, town services, and public schools. For too long now, town meeting has been presented with zoning changes without the benefit of a long-term vision and plan for growth. The decisions that we are being asked to make this evening and additional growth decisions that will be brought forward at the annual town meeting impact not only today's residents, but generations of residents to come. We owe it to ourselves and to the voters to make decisions based on a long-term vision and planning framework developed through extensive input from the public, analysis of cost and benefits, and most importantly, facts. We do not have that framework today, and we desperately need it. You have two very different referral options in front of you this evening. If you're satisfied with the information that you've been provided with, as you've been asked to make zoning decisions, then by all means, vote for the Dempsey motion. The Dempsey motion maintains the status quo of having zoning and growth changes offered to you without the benefit of a vision and direction and a clear understanding of cost and benefits to our community.
1 minute.
If, however, you believe that we are entering a unique and critical period of decision-making that will fundamentally impact what it is like to live, work, visit, and play in Brookline, then vote for the Pelkey motion and refer both Articles 27 and 34 to the Select Board. The Pelkey motion is the only motion that directs the Select Board to develop a long-term growth plan for Brookline that will help town meeting properly evaluate and decide on future zoning proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Jesse Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This is Jesse Gray, Precinct 10, and I have to admit I'm not speaking from a micro unit. I'm not going to reveal the square footage, but I am speaking in favor of the Dempsey motion and against the Pelkey-Margolis advisory motion. Both motions would refer a narrowly crafted micro unit zoning bylaw, a warrant article that was fighting hard for the status quo ante. The status quo prior to the 2018 Emerald Island overlay. This warrant article indeed was largely intended to correct an inadvertent mistake. The Dempsey motion refers commensurately. In contrast, the Pelkey-Margolis advisory motion, by a common sense, if not legal definition, expands the scope of the original warrant article since it creates a brand new committee to consider comprehensive zoning changes that go well beyond what was described in the original warrant article 27. There's a time and a place to decide to drop hundreds of thousands of dollars on a 5-year comprehensive zoning plan. That time and that place is not in a last-minute post-Thanksgiving referral motion on a narrowly constructed zoning amendment. Zoning is one of the most powerful tools we have in this town to make sure that our values are enacted. It is also, I want to acknowledge, complex, and any changes in zoning should absolutely be well considered. That said, it is very hard, sometimes impossible, to make meaningful change on affordable housing, on climate, and on other urgent expressions of values without at least bringing before this body some choices. These changes are impossible to present to this body on realistic timescales when simple changes in the right direction are met with demands for comprehensive committees that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and take half a decade to conduct. Promises of comprehensive planning have already kept new proposals on the shelf for years in this town. If someone wants to ask the select board for a comprehensive committee on zoning, they should go to the select board and ask for that committee. That's what we've done to ask for changes on climate-related zoning. So please join me in asking for the plan for any comprehensive planning to be done as carefully as any zoning bylaw itself should be done. Please vote no on Pelkey, yes on Dempsey. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pollack. Pollak, David. We'll hear from Mr. Pollack and one more Dempsey supporter, and then I'll take the motion for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and good evening, everybody. David Pollack, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 11. I'm an architect and community planner, and like Linda, I work almost entirely for Massachusetts cities, towns, and local housing authorities. I'm also a new member of the Advisory Committee and its Planning and Regulation Subcommittee, but I'm speaking only for myself at the moment, and I'm speaking in favor of the Pelkey referral motion. To be clear, I'm sympathetic to both of these warrant articles. I come to my views from a very different place than Linda. On warrant article 27, we just shouldn't be outlawing small homes in our zoning bylaw. This is bad policy. Minimum dwelling size and habitability are directly and quite adequately addressed by the state's building code. I view telling people they can't live modestly in a small apartment in Brookline as micromanagement. Are we going to also tell people that they can't build big houses? That would be an easy case to make in the battle to stem climate change. On warrant article 34, I strongly support increasing housing affordability in Brookline and believe that this is a worthy focus for our collective investment. I strongly support economic development in Brookline, and I believe that appropriate new housing development, along with appropriate new commercial development, can both ease the tax burden on homeowners and support increased investment in our town. So I support the intent of warrant article 27 and I support warrant article 34. But in this moment, I speak in support of the Pelkey referral motion because it gives us the opportunity to immediately start the work of rationalizing and updating our zoning bylaw to more truly and effectively reflect our community's values. The criticisms that our zoning bylaw is an antiquated patchwork are real. Making our zoning work better for all of us is a big, vital project. It needs focus and funding, and the Pelkey motion provides both. If we just address micro units, we delay by at least a half a year the opportunity to thoughtfully, carefully, inclusively, and comprehensively undertake meaningful zoning reform. So let's do zoning right. Please support the Pelkey referral motion.
Thank you, Mr. Klein.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening. Jonathan Klein, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 10. As a young lawyer, I'm now retired, we were told the old adage that if the law was on your side, argue the law. If the facts were on your side, argue the facts. And if neither was on your side, pound the table. And a corollary applies here to process and substance. But I don't have to pound the table. There is no table, since the Advisory Committee and Pelkey motion fails on both process and substance. Let's talk about substance first. Many others have covered this, so I'll cover it briefly. These so-called micro units, in my day, they were just small apartments. I lived in one when I was younger. They've existed for decades. They were fully legal, as you've heard. And warrant article 27 is a simple proposal to restore that use to where it was before 2016. When all real estate seems to be priced per square foot, it doesn't take a math whiz, and I'm not one, to figure out that smaller apartments are more affordable apartments. And with the affordability crisis, it's pretty simple to conclude that we should restore this as a perfectly acceptable housing type as part of addressing our housing affordability challenge. But I mostly want to talk, as the moderator has suggested, about process, about these referral motions. You know, warrant article 27 apparently has a technical defect related to ground floor commercial space that no one caught till the last minute. Well, shame on us. And the straightforward solution is to refer it to the planning department to come up with corrective language, which they've said they can do, and get it back for Springtown meeting so we can debate and discuss and decide on the merits. And the Dempsey motion provides for this. But you're also being asked to consider the advisory committee and Pelkey motion, which at the very last minute, I have to emphasize, this proposal was floated over Thanksgiving weekend and then introduced to AC and the select board an hour before our town meeting reconvened on Monday. It attempts to use this simple problem as an excuse to create a new planning and zoning oversight committee to recommend and commence a process for systematically updating our comprehensive plan and zoning with quote necessary funding and quote an interim report in a year. So let's stop everything for a year, find the necessary funding. And by the way, didn't the advisory committee just tell us last night we didn't have enough money to pay a stipend to our hardworking select board and school committee members, and then get just an interim report in a year? Now, I want to be really clear. I am not against comprehensive planning, but I am against initiating a comprehensive planning process on the fly at the very last minute through a referral motion. This is not comprehensive planning. It's the opposite of good planning. The last time the town did a comprehensive plan, it took 4 years, $300,000, maybe more. If we want to do that, let's have a proper warrant article. Let's have it reviewed. Let's discuss it. Maybe it's a good idea. To summarize, on substance, microunits are a good and important housing resource. They were legal before 2016. They need to be continued. And on process, let's not use the need for a technical fix to drive a very last minute creation of a new quote uber comprehensive committee, which will be costly and have the practical effect of stopping all the other good work we're doing on housing affordability, climate change, and other critical changes. It is not what we need or want for Brookline. So please vote no on the Pelkey motion and yes on the Dempsey motion. Thank you very much.
We have a motion for the question. We've been at this for 40 minutes or so, and I think we've heard a good presentation of the merits of both of these referral motions. I regret to announce that we have about 30 people signed up to speak. The following people in favor of the Dempsey motion: Ms. Cunningham, Mr. Vitolo, Mr. Heiken, Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Zimmerman, Mr. Englander, Mr. Hellerstein, Mr. Christ. We have the following people signed up to speak in favor of the Pelkey motion: Ms. Khan, Mr. Wyszynski, Mr. Gordon, Mr. Davis, Ms. Friedman, and we have the following people listed who essentially came to the microphone during the debate: Mr. Fishman, Mr. Englander, I'm sorry, first Ms. Schatz, Mr. Fishman, Mr. Englander, Ms. Levine, Mr. Toffel, Ms. Schweitzer, Mr. Sandman, Mr. Gladstone, Ms. Gilman, Ms. Roberts, Mr. Rosenthal, Mr. Levy, Mr. Richmond, Mr. Siegel, Mr. Bassett, and Mr. Fisher. This is a motion for the question, Article 27. All right, the voting period has commenced. The voting elapsed. Mr. Jones.
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally?
Abstain.
May I have the count, please?
161 yes, 50 no, 8 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 162 in favor, 50 opposed, and 9 abstentions. Ladies and gentlemen, we will vote first on the Pelkey referral motion on page 1 of supplement number 2. You've heard it described. It would have the refer to a select board appointed Planning and Zoning Oversight Committee. If that passes, if that is approved, move on to Article 34. If it is not approved, we will move to the vote on the Dempsey referral motion on supplement number 3 to refer the subject matter of Article 27 to the Planning Department. And if that succeeds, we will move to Article 34. If it fails, we will deal with the main motion and amendment.
Yeah, we should give him like another 10 seconds.
So sorry, I talked through the voting period, but I think you all responded and voted. Okay, the time has elapsed. Mr. Jones? This is on the Pelkey referral.
Jones, no.
No. Ms. McNally?
McNally, no.
May I have the count, please?
96 yes, 113 no, 6 abstentions.
Motion fails by a vote of 96 in favor, 117, 15 opposed, and 6 abstentions.
Mr. Moderator, you have several points of order. The first one is from Jonathan Margolis.
Mr. Margolis?
My point of order may have been mooted, but as you noted, you were speaking over the motion, describing the motion during the voting time, and the voting screen did not come on until a significant amount of the time had elapsed.
And we gave you 15 extra seconds of voting time to accommodate that issue.
Thank you.
The next point of order is from Mr. Davis, Jonathan Davis.
Jonathan Davis?
Yes, Mr. Moderator. Essentially, I could not see the clock ticking down while you were talking because as you were basically hiding, unintentionally, I'm sure, the clock. And you said, then finally, you said, well, you've all had enough time, and we're going to, and the time for voting is over. I think that I don't believe that I'm the only person who was unable to, first of all, be confused as to whether or not there was going to be, the time had begun or not to vote because the clock was obscured.
Well,
so I ask that we have a re-vote.
Well, we're not going to have a re-vote, Mr. Davis, and I'll tell you why. We had 221 people vote on the motion for the question. We had 217 vote for or against the Pelkey motion. And I think it's a valid vote. We gave you 15 extra seconds to vote after I stopped talking. We had obviously a coordination issue up here on the stage, but we're not going to have a re-vote.
Michael Bernstein has a question of privilege.
Mr. Burstein.
Mr. Moderator, Michael Burstein, Precinct 12. I'm asking you to reevaluate what you just said as a question of privilege, because it was a lot more than just you talking through the voting. A voting box came up, then it disappeared, then it came up, as if it had the previous votes, it disappeared. It came up again. I think I managed to vote the way I wanted to, but given that we cannot check our votes and correct them because this is the last session of town meeting, I humbly suggest that maybe we should do a revote on this because of technological issues. Thank you, sir.
Well, I think Mr. Burstein makes a good point, and I think Mr. Davis makes a good point, and we have the same audience here, and okay. Yes, I want you to wipe it out, and we're going to have a revote. Well, I'm going to have the revote, and then if the points of order have not been satisfied, we'll hear them after we vote. Okay, so there is a voting period. Yes, if you favor the Pelkey motion, no if you're opposed, and abstain if you're abstaining. All right, the voting period has lapsed. Mr. Jones, still no.
Jones, no.
Ms. McNally?
McNally, no.
And the count?
100 yes, 122 no, 6 abstentions.
Motion fails by a vote of 100 in favor, 124 opposed, and 6 abstentions. And the other points of order? Okay, thank you. All right, the Pelkey referral motion failed. We now vote on the Dempsey referral motion, which would refer the subject matter of Article 27 to the Planning Board to be reported back before the 2021 annual town meeting. And the voting has commenced. This is on the Dempsey referral motion. Voting period. Mr. Jones?
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally?
Yes. Ms. McNally?
McNally, yes.
And the count, please.
190 yes, 23 no, 13 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 192 in favor, 23 opposed, and 13 abstentions. We now turn to Article 34. The main motion under Article 34 is on supplement number 3, entitled Revised Petitioner's Motion, that the town adopt a resolution relating to Brookline's housing unaffordability, moved by, over to the page 3 of supplement number 3, moved by Ms. Fisher, seconded by Ms. Schweitzer. There is a substitute motion on pages 34-12 24 to 34-26 of your combined reports, moved by Mr. Wyszynski and seconded by Ms. Hamilton. It's the motion of the Advisory Committee and Select Board. And if you'll please turn to the page 34-24, actually 34-25, you'll see that there are a number of numbered paragraphs that are improperly numbered. Should be paragraphs 1 through 5, not 6 through 10. So those changes are made in the Advisory Committee and Select Board motion on page 34-24. Ms. Pelkey is withdrawing her motion to refer, since her motion to refer under Article 27 was not approved. So we have before us the petitioner's motion of Ms. Fisher and the substitute motion moved by Mr. Wyszynski and seconded by Ms. Hamilton. When it comes to voting, we will vote on the substitute motion first and then on the main motion, which will either be the substitute motion if you approve it or the petitioner's motion if you don't approve it. Mr. Wachter. Wachter.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Jeff Wachter. I'm a Brookline resident in Precinct 8 and the lead petitioner on warrant Article 34. As nearly everyone recognizes, Brookline has a serious problem with housing affordability, with low-income folks effectively needing to win the housing lottery to live in Brookline. And according to the 2016 Housing Production Plan, even middle-income households are hard-pressed to find housing they can afford. What is crucial to recognize is that we actually face two affordability challenges at the same time. One, which is more straightforward, is that many people in our community and our region simply don't have enough money to afford a safe, stable place to live. We need to address this through subsidized housing targeting people at various low-income levels. The Housing Advisory Board, the Brookline Housing Authority, and the Brookline Improvement Coalition serve as local institutions attacking this problem head-on and are limited by funding. Town meeting has worked hard to address this through policy proposals such as the Community Preservation Act and the Real Estate Transfer Tax, and we rely on annual local budget appropriations, state's 40B legislation, state and federal funding, and nonprofits leveraging multiple funding sources to produce additional income-restricted units. Our inclusionary zoning bylaw also serves a crucial role in producing subsidized housing, but is only useful if we allow new housing to be built in the first place. However, this leaves out a significant swath of Brookline residents who also struggle with escalating housing costs. According to analysis by local real estate expert Avi Kaufman, a typical family of 4 earning 200% of area median income, more than $200,000, struggles to find an affordable housing option here in Brookline. Families making less struggle even more, and our teachers and other town workers, as well as other valuable members of our community, such as nonprofit professionals, construction workers, nurses, and so many others, can't even consider making their home in Brookline. Economists and policymakers from across the ideological spectrum, from Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to Charlie Baker and Indiana Senator Todd Young, as well as top economists, have come to similar conclusions. A significant factor of the housing affordability problem facing middle and upper middle income folks is a lack of housing supply. The 2020 Democratic National Convention platform agrees, clearly stating that the government should take aggressive steps to increase the supply of housing. While it's obviously true that housing economics is more complicated than Econ 101 supply and demand curves, the housing market, even in Brookline, is not immune to supply and demand effects. The 2016 Housing Production Plan noted that, quote, since the town's housing supply falls far short of demand, the price of entry into Brookline's housing market has skyrocketed. This idea was also repeated by multiple speakers during the short-term rental debate during this town meeting. If removing units for vacation rentals would have a negative effect on our local housing market, adding units would have a positive effect. And professional housing economists draw a similar conclusion from their research. A 2019 paper from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank and the Upjohn Institute found that, quote, new buildings slow local rent increases. Housing economist Evan Mast found that new market rate construction substantially loosens the market for middle and low income housing. Which brings us to warrant Article 34. This resolution calls on town meeting to recognize our housing affordability crises, the historical redlining and racial exclusion baked into our current zoning code that continues to result in a less diverse Brookline, and the important role density and walkability can play in lowering our regional carbon emissions and climate impact. Specifically, the resolution asks for a robust planning process, utilizing a new housing production plan currently being rolled out, to develop specific zoning bylaw recommendations to encourage and incentivize additional housing units, including where and at what level, and to set a numeric target for local housing production. Then calls for concrete zoning and regulatory proposals to implement the recommendations from this process. The resolution calls on these proposals to proactively seek racial and ethnic integration in Brookline and move us toward a more sustainable future by maximizing access to public and active transportation and car-free or car-light options. And importantly, the resolution calls on the Select Board to ensure that appointees to relevant boards and commissions are aware of the housing production goals and targets developed through the Housing Production Plan. All too often, important plans get produced and then ignored or forgotten when the time to actually implement the plans arrive. And finally, it's important that we recognize the need to appropriately fund the departments and professionals tasked with implementing the proposals. Warrant Article 34 is a statement of values that points out many of the reasons that Brookline needs to be building more housing, and asks that the town bodies tasked with planning and zoning focus their attention on determining the best approach to achieve this goal. It is not prescriptive in any way beyond the acknowledgement that the housing affordability crisis facing a huge swath of town residents has been exacerbated by our restrictive zoning regulations.
1 minute.
That significantly hamper housing production. Housing production alone is not a silver bullet, but it is a vital component of any strategy that seriously hopes to make Brookline more open, welcoming, and affordable. In conclusion, I ask that you vote no action on the advisory committee's amended version and favorable action on Warrant Article 34 as moved by the petitioners and endorsed unanimously by EDAB, HAB, and CDICR, so we can work toward building a more inclusive, more sustainable, more open, and more economically diverse Brookline that aligns with our community values. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wyszynski.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Neil Wyszynski, Precinct 5 for the Advisory Committee. Should building more housing units to address the high cost of housing in Brookline be the primary goal of the town's planning efforts? The petitioners say yes. That is the question at the core of Article 34 of the Article 34 resolution. The Advisory Committee is broadly supportive of the petitioner's overarching goal of increasing housing affordability. And the vast majority wants to increase the number of really affordable units in town. However, there was absolutely no support for just increasing the number of housing units as the primary path to achieving housing affordability, as the petitioners suggest. The advisory motion asks for a holistic study of the costs and benefits of housing growth with a focus on housing mix under different scenarios, and then to use that information to determine one, whether to encourage housing growth, 2, how much housing to add, 3, how to accomplish it, and 4, most importantly, where to add it. The predisposition towards a particular solution is the essential difference between the two versions of the resolution. The petitioner's motion asks you to urge the town to set a policy of building significant numbers of housing units as a means to address affordability. After that, you study how and where to build them. We have many concerns with the petitioner's approach. First was the original numeric goal of adding 3,300 new housing units, a goal which the petitioners have deleted from their more recent draft, but is really an indication of where they want the town to go. To put that number in perspective, the controversial Hancock Village expansion has been approved for 421 additional units, which are now being built. The petitioner's original goal would have us adding the equivalent of not 1, not 2, not even 3, but almost 8 Hancock Village expansions. With that in mind, we felt that a numeric goal was premature and the math behind the number was questionable. We also don't buy the argument that indiscriminately adding more housing units in town is the best way to create more affordability. After all, this is a regional problem, and Brookline has a very small piece of the regional housing market. We must also recognize that Brookline is a built-up community, and especially in more urban sections of town, new buildings usually require tearing down and replacing them with much larger structures with generally more expensive housing. This is so even considering the 15% affordable unit requirement of our inclusionary zoning. We need to be careful not to incentivize indiscriminate teardowns in the cause of creating density. We also heard that Brookline's housing growth has been slower than that of neighboring communities, and thus we haven't been doing our fair share to solve the regional housing shortage. This ignores Brookline's relative lack of developable land. Many nearby communities have former industrial sites and even farm or woodland opportunity sites that we just don't have. The advisory motion urges the town to engage in a robust planning process and build off the successful 2016 housing production plan with a focus on ensuring a mix of housing for different income levels for any new housing. It asks that policy proposals be studied to understand the impacts as well as the benefits to the town. It lists several impact areas to be studied, including public works, open space, education, and the historic streetscape. Another key difference between the advisory and the petitioner versions is that the advisory motion deletes what we considered as litmus tests, in which in the original motion would have required candidates to appointed boards to affirmatively agree to the petitioner's housing agenda. While this objectionable provision has been considerably softened in the petitioner's latest version, it's still there. Most of us agree that Brookline is a great place to live. We also have a pressing need to broaden housing opportunities, particularly for prospective low and middle income residents. Do you feel there's been sufficient community engagement and analysis to commit to a specific reprioritization of our primary planning focus? Are you ready to start the train rolling towards the petitioner's stated version of adding the equivalent of 8 Hancock Village expansions to Brookline? If you are, if you answer yes to these questions, sure, vote for the petitioner's motion. The advisory committee is not ready to go there yet. The advisory committee voted a unanimous recommendation of no action by a vote of 0 to 26 on the petitioner's motion, and voted to recommend favorable action on the motion before you with a vote of 22 to 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zimmerman.
Yes. Did you end up getting my slides or no? Ah, fantastic. Don't worry, there's only 2 slides here because I know I have to be brief. So I am Amanda Zimmerman, town meeting member, Precinct 8, and a co-petitioner of this warrant article. I know that we wrote a mini dissertation in the warrant article description, but I wanted to touch on 2 issues tonight that personally and particularly motivated me in both writing and supporting warrant article 34. Next slide. The first is the topic of exclusion. For the last 180 years, our housing policy has affected who can live in town, originally by racial covenants, which Brookline invented, and then by redlining, and now by exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary policies, like those which disallow smaller and naturally more affordable units, or those that forbid multifamily houses, or those that require large lot size, or those that require excessive parking. Exclusionary policies like these make it difficult for people without intergenerational wealth to afford to live here. These policies directly impact the racial and economic diversity in Brookline. According to a 2013 study of Metro Boston by economist Matthew Ressiger, allowing more housing generally, but especially multifamily housing, increases the proportion of Black and Hispanic residents. Yet these kinds of multifamily apartment buildings that have been tied directly to diversity are only allowed to be built today in a small geographic section of town. It is shocking, but not surprising, that almost all of these areas and the exact borders of our current zoning for multifamily housing match the areas on the redlining maps listed as either declining or hazardous. Not coincidentally, the only part of Brookline that is more than 20% Black today coincides with the part of the town redlined more than 80 years ago.
1 minute.
We need to think about what it means to have housing policies designed to exclude. This town meeting has repeatedly downzoned, making fewer areas of town where apartment and condo buildings are allowed. Immigrants welcome should be more than just a slogan, but it cannot be when seniors, families, and neighbors generally are priced out by ever skyrocketing housing costs. We can see this effect by looking at our renters. Almost half of Brookline's renters are housing cost burdened, with a quarter spending more than half of their household income on housing. A community which claims to be welcoming cannot simultaneously be actively constraining housing supply and willfully accelerating the spiral on housing costs. Next slide. The last thing I want everyone here to think about is how our housing policy is intimately linked to our climate action goals. We cannot think of Brookline as a bubble. We are part of a metro region that has added over 148,000 jobs and 110,000 residents in the last 10 years. As our population grows, our new coworkers and classmates and friends and neighbors have to go somewhere. We have to think with our 3 transit lines and numerous bus lines that by increasing our housing stock, Brookline can help address this housing shortage, and that Brookline can allow residents to have a much smaller carbon footprint. We can no longer pretend that housing policy is not climate policy. We can use housing policy to either worsen our regional carbon footprint or lessen it. Brookline strives to lead on climate change inclusivity and on modeling a livable urban existence. Please join me in making a commitment to these goals and vote favorable action on the petitioner's version of Warrant Article 34. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pelkey, do you wish to speak?
Yes.
Okay, you're on.
Good evening. Linda Olson Pelkey, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2. Warrant Article 34 asks Town Meeting to pass a resolution pledging town support for building many new housing units in Brookline by 2030. The stated goals of the resolution are to increase the racial and economic diversity of the population living here and to reduce the cost of housing. While these are noble goals, this resolution, even if carried out, will not achieve the desired results. We know that in Brookline, if left to the market, we will get more luxury housing. This resolution puts the cart before the horse, reaching a conclusion before looking into the feasibility or impacts of such a drastic change. In fact, recent research published in Urban Studies has shown that upzoning is far from the progressive policy tool it has been sold to be. It mainly leads to building high-end housing in desirable locations. In a recent memo from Allison Steinfeld, our planning director, she reported that Brookline has permitted 1,132 new housing units since 2015, which is already a significant increase in our housing stock. Because Brookline is substantially already built out, new market rate housing will most likely cause the demolition or redevelopment of our older, less expensive housing stock. In fact, such a scenario is a recipe for widespread gentrification and displacement of current low to moderate income residents living in older housing. Such demolition and redevelopment also threatens our existing local businesses. As a regional housing question, it's important to note that some adjacent communities, namely Cambridge and Boston, have added significant employment growth. These communities also had significantly higher population levels in the past, and therefore have excess infrastructure available to absorb new residents.
1 minute.
Our housing slide only, I had asked for 5 minutes for this, sir.
I'm sorry. You have
Okay.
5 minutes.
Can I have to go back and figure out where it is? Okay. Because Brookline is substantially already built out, new market rate housing will most likely cause the demolition and redevelopment of our older, less expensive housing stock. As a regional housing question, it's important to note that some adjacent communities have added significant employment growth. These communities also had a higher population in the past and therefore have excess infrastructure. Growing our housing supply will simply make Brookline even more of a bedroom community for these employment centers. And Brookline is currently at its historic peak population, and 75% of our housing units are in multifamily buildings. It's likely that our post-COVID work lives will be quite different than pre-COVID, and a great deal of unused office space may become available for repurposing. The diminished imperative to commute to downtown Boston for work and recent proposals for service cuts to the MBTA may also fundamentally change the demand for close-in housing. Given the fact that North Brookline is just about as dense as Somerville, does it make sense to expect additional density? Does Brookline have the land, infrastructure, town services, park and recreation space, and transportation infrastructure necessary to absorb this large growth? Where would these new housing units be built? How much of our current housing stock would be replaced, thereby causing a net displacement of lower income residents? What would be the impact of these changes on our livability, character, and desirability of Brookline? If petitioners offer no answers or analysis to support their claims, but we can thank them for raising these issues, and we should look at where we might add more housing. That's why I wanted to recommend this article to the Planning and Zoning Committee. In summary, this resolution is entirely theoretical. It puts the cart before the horse and before the necessary analyses are done. I want us to get excited about the great potential benefits to Brookline's future of availing ourselves of the many new planning and zoning tools that can help us manage our growth in a much better way. I've seen how these new tools have helped other communities make serious progress in terms of livability and sustainability. But we can't do that if we don't reach for that brass ring by choosing to engage in a robust, comprehensive planning process. Please vote no on both the petitioner's version and the advisory committee version. And if you must vote for one of these, please vote for the advisory version. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Levine. Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Megan Levine, town meeting member from Precinct 3. I grew up in upstate New York and first moved to Boston for college. During my freshman year, one of my first memories is going to Zoftig's, where I quickly fell in love with both the matzo ball soup and with Brookline. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do after college, but I knew where I wanted to live after graduation. I wanted to live in Brookline. I've had the pleasure, and sometimes not as much of a pleasure, of renting apartments in 4 different areas of our beautiful town. I still rent in Brookline, and I still love it here. But if you've tried to buy property in Brookline lately, you know there are very few affordable options. Brookline median housing prices are some of the highest in Massachusetts, with a median value of $1.5 million for a single family home and close to $700,000 for a condo. Speaking as a millennial who's still early on in my career, I just can't afford it. And for those of you who have kids around my age, they probably can't either. At some point, I'd like to be able to own a home in Brookline. With the goals of Article 34, I hope to have that choice. Please vote no action on the AC amendment and favorable action on Article 34. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton.
Thank you. Heather Hamilton for a unanimous select board. Warrant Article 34 is a resolution that seeks to advocate for us to take more proactive steps when it comes to building more housing. The amended motion, as first offered by the advisory committee and now supported by the select board, references key processes and housing initiatives currently underway, like zoning reform and housing production plan, that can get us to a more inclusive, sustainable, and affordable future. The select board urges favorable action on the amended motion.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening, Jonathan Klein, town meeting member, Precinct 10. I'm also a member of the Housing Advisory Board, which after meeting with the petitioners several times over many months and negotiating meaningful changes to the resolution, unanimously endorsed the petitioner's current version of warrant Article 34. I moved to Brookline about 13 years ago, well after my children were off to college, perhaps a little backwards considering the great schools here. But the truth is I couldn't afford to buy in Brookline early in my career. As I read all the material in the combined reports on warrant Article 34, I found detail after detail about the dramatic decline over decades in our housing production, the increasing unaffordability of Brookline, and the sad history of racial segregation and exclusion. I was and continue to be appalled by the staggering costs of rents and home ownership here, imposing huge burdens on many of our residents and making it just impossible for many to move here. I'm not going to repeat those details or studies or give you a high-blown economic theory, but I just want to talk about basics and values. Look around. Look at the prices of condominiums, houses, rents, appallingly high. Even in this soft market, as I think someone from the staff said, prices have only moved a little down or maybe not at all. Now, that's great for us, frankly, almost all white folks, by the way, who are privileged to own homes and see our equity increase year after year, but it's not so good for everyone else. The studies cited by the petitioners in the combined reports demonstrate that increasing supply does matter. And if we create a plan to increase supply strategically by developing a framework incentivizing projects that provide low, middle, and market rate units, we can over time make a difference. Brookline can become more affordable and welcoming to a more diverse population. Now, as many of you know, much of the housing built here in the last 5 years has been under Chapter 40B, the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. And now that we've reached our 10% threshold, which is an important accomplishment we should all be very proud of, we need to decide what comes next, who we are and who we want to be. Do we want to simply say, we've done our part, batten down the hatches, go about our business and keep Brookline lovely for all of us who are here already? Or do we want to make a commitment to the community we want to be? Open, lively, diverse, and welcoming. Do we own Brookline because we got here first? Or do we want to be a community that cares about and welcomes others? Warrant Article 34 calls on this town meeting in this post-40B environment to recognize our continuing housing affordability challenges, along with the history of redlining and racial exclusion, and to commit to a planning process through the upcoming revision of our housing production plan, which will be a very careful, thoughtful planning process to develop specific, detailed policies to incentivize additional housing for all income levels. So to summarize, please vote.
Summarize quickly because you're out of time.
Petitioners and unanimously approved by the HAB and the EDAB and the CDICR, and vote no on the much weaker version put forward by the Select Board and Advisory Committee. We need to put town meeting on record favoring a welcoming, economically and racially diverse, and sustainable Brookline that aligns with our values. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodreo. RIDRUEJO.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Carlos Hidrejo, Town Meeting Member for Precinct 14 and Chair of the Sustainability Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee, but speaking for myself. I wanted to speak in support of the motion amended by the Advisory Committee because I feel that we have to do a lot more careful analysis of how we approach the addition of much necessary housing units and evaluate its impact on climate change and the environment. The petitioner suggests sustainability is achieved by the close access to public transit. This is only part of the equation. I will explain why. As a registered architect, I want to suggest that we may be able to achieve, but need to do a lot of this in a sustainable, environmentally conscious way that aligns with our climate initiative goals. We need more analysis, as the advisory committee suggests. Regionally speaking, other parts of Greater Boston have been able to add scores of housing units by reconverting and reusing existing obsolete light industrial land into modern housing units. These parcels, which were either abandoned or underutilized under the demise of their industrial use, were reconverted into mixed and residential use. Great examples are Somerville's obsolete Ford factory, reimagined as Assembly Square, Boston's obsolete warehouses and rail yards and parking lots turned into vibrant Seaport and Fenway areas, Cambridge's failed NASA project of the 1960s reborn as Kendall Square, and finally, Watertown's decommissioned Army Arsenal currently being transformed as Arsenal Yards. Unfortunately, Brookline does not have any similar examples of this obsolete light industrial parcels, other than perhaps parts of Route 9, and maybe one day the MBTA sheds at Cleveland Circle. Why do I bring this up? Because this means that the most of the redevelopment efforts to add large amounts of housing units in our town will have to happen on parcels which are currently either open space or already used for housing. Why does this matter? Yes, it is little doubt that a modern building is more efficient and uses less energy than an older building. When we replace buildings, we have to take into account the embodied energy and carbon in them. We have to evaluate it, what it means for the environment to replace existing housing stock with new housing. We also need to consider energy and carbon it took to create the materials, transport them to the site, assemble them into an original building. Then the energy and carbon needs to needed to disassemble, transport, and dispose or recycle those original buildings and then replace them again with a brand new building. I do not have the answer, but I think we need to have more analysis of how we go ahead adding the much needed housing units for because of environmental reasons. I commend the petitioners for bringing up the subject of housing and affordability to our meeting. their town meeting, and there's no doubt that we need to make Brookline more affordable and equitable. Thank you.
Thank you. There's been a motion for the question, and I believe that we've had an adequate airing of both sides of the issue and both the motions before you. I have the following people signed up to speak in favor of the petitioner's motion: Ms. Fisher, Ms. Nobrega, Ms. Brown, Ms. Schatz, Ms. Cunningham, Ms. Schweitzer, and Ms. Scanlon. I have the following people either opposing both or opposing the in favor of the advisory committee motion: Mr. Pollock and Mr. Spiegel. The following have come to the microphone, so to speak, figuratively: Mr. Franco, Mr. Van Scoyac, Mr. Levy, Mr. Toffel, and Mr. Gayshak. So this is a motion for the question to terminate debate, and it requires a 2/3 vote. Okay, the voting period has commenced. Vote yes if you favor terminating debate, no if you wish to hear more from those I've mentioned, and abstain if you're abstaining. Voting period has. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Ms. McNally.
Jones, no.
No. Ms. McNally.
McNally, no.
And the count?
We got 154 yes, 64 no, 4 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 154 in favor, 66 opposed, and 4 abstentions? 4 abstentions. So we proceed to the advisory committee and select board motion on pages 34-24 to 26. This is SB substitute motion. And the voting period has commenced. Yeah, you'll see. Voting period has terminated. Jones.
Jones, no.
Ms. McNally.
McNally, no.
Count, please.
130 yes, 86 no, 6 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 130 in favor, 88 opposed, and 6 abstentions. So that the advisory committee and select board motion becomes the main motion, but we need another vote on the main motion. So this is Article 34 main motion. Again, the motion is on page 34-24. And the voting period has commenced. Voting period has turned. Mr. Jones,
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
and the count, please.
191 yes, 26 no, 8 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 193 in favor, 26 opposed, and 8 abstentions. Please turn to Article 38 and 39, which will be debated together. The main motion under Article 38 is on page 38-3 over to the bottom of page 38-5. Move that a resolution calling for swift, just building decarbonization in the Commonwealth. Moved by Ms. Cunningham, seconded by Ms. Heller. The main motion under Article 39 is on the blue supplement, number 1, page 2, to authorize the Select Board to file a petition with the General Court to ratify the adoption of, at the 2019 special town meeting, of our article that we entitled Prohibition on New Fossil Fuel Infrastructure in Certain Construction, moved by Mr. Rodrigo and seconded by Ms. Cunningham. This motion goes over to the over to page 3 of the top of page 3 of that supplement number 1. Ms. Cunningham?
Hi, Mr. Moderator. Jessie Gray is actually going to speak first, and we're going to combine our presentations. Jessie Gray will go first. I'll go second, and Kathleen Scanlon will go third.
Mr. Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This is Jessie Gray, Precinct 10. And this evening, we are excited to present for your consideration 2 articles that are continuations of the important journey that we began last fall, when this town meeting, by a historic vote of 211-3, passed a prohibition on new fossil fuel infrastructure in new construction and major renovations, then known as Warrant Article 21. Although last fall's Warrant Article 21 vote was groundbreaking, although it inspired dozens of other communities to consider adopting it, although the Massachusetts Attorney General endorsed its policy goals, and although it resulted in the Attorney General's office petitioning the Department of Public Utilities to investigate the gas industry and present plans for decarbonization, nonetheless, Warrant Article 21 was disallowed by the Attorney General. This disallowal earlier this summer revealed legacy laws that protect the fossil fuel industry change that we all know is needed. Despite being stymied legally, our movement made the pages of the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and was featured in dozens of publications and media programs. We sent a powerful signal that the era of fossil fuels is ending. I'm proud of what we've done so far because we found in Warrant Article 21 a policy that is at the intersection of impactful, practical, and now very clearly also politically possible. Even though it turned out not as formulated so far to be legally possible here in Massachusetts, I'm proud of this town for creating a new political consensus about how we can move forward. In the meantime, many additional communities in California, large swaths of Europe, have committed to stop building fossil fuel buildings entirely. We are already part of a domino effect. Still, here in Brookline, we have yet to actually implement the policy that we all agreed upon. Therefore, tonight we present 2 new warrant articles, 38 and 39, a resolution for swift and just building decarbonization in the Commonwealth, and a home rule petition asking the state legislature to allow us to enact the original warrant article 21. These current articles were endorsed unanimously by the Select Board, the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, Mothers Out Front, the School Committee, the Green Caucus. In addition, 95% of the Advisory Committee also voted in favor. These requests are a necessary first step on the way to a sustainable planet because we got to stop building brand new fossil fuel infrastructure that lasts for decades, increasing our carbon emissions and creating an unlivable planet. We took the first step together last year, and we succeeded because it turns out to be practical and cost-effective to build without fossil fuel infrastructure. We also succeeded thanks to a lot of help from town staff, EDAB, the advisory committee, and you here in town meeting. So now, let's take the next step. Let's ask the Commonwealth to allow us to require that in our community and in others, we stop installing brand new fossil fuel infrastructure and instead install electric alternatives when it's convenient, practical, and cost-effective to do so. Thank you, and on to Lisa.
Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Cunningham, whoever's next.
Thank you. Lisa Cunningham, town meeting member, precinct 15. From the moment we passed our warrant article, last fall's warrant article 21, we knew that our mandate was to build a movement to get other towns and cities to follow us. We held seminars and webinars to respond to the intense interest from other municipalities to enact their own legislation, following in Brookline's footsteps, informally advising numerous towns and cities across the state. This led to an invitation to partner with a premier national climate think tank, the Rocky Mountain Institute, with whom we launched a building electrification accelerator program with 16 diverse towns and cities throughout Massachusetts. What do these warrant articles do? Warrant Article 38, a resolution calling for swift, just building decarbonization in the Commonwealth, calls upon the Massachusetts State Legislature, the Department of Public Utilities, and the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, otherwise known as the BBRS, to take actions toward building decarbonization to meet our climate goals. The resolution emphasizes a just transition, calling on the state to ensure that the benefits of building electrification are distributed equitably and that impacted workers are treated fairly. Low-income communities and communities of color are already disproportionately impacted by climate change and will continue to bear an excess burden as temperatures increase, oceans rise, and disasters worsen. Without aggressive statewide building decarbonization policies, building and zoning codes aligned with our climate goals, and a thoughtful but rapid planned transition away from fossil fuels, we will be unable to meet our legally binding and scientifically imperative statewide emission targets. We have committed as a town and as a state to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Scientifically, we know we have less than 10 years to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Our outdated legacy laws and systems must change immediately for us to have any hope of addressing our climate crisis. But we must change as well. The second warrant article 39, is a home rule petition that requests that the state legislature give Brookline the authority to implement our original fossil fuel prohibition. To be clear, the end goal is not solely for our town to possess unique building electrification powers. Instead, this petition seeks to pressure the state legislature to focus on overturning its harmful legacy laws and systems and continue to call for the urgent need for state level action. Both the resolution and the home rule petition are now being taken up by a number of other towns and cities. In fact, the town of Arlington has already beaten us to the punch by passing their own home rule petition with overwhelming support last week. Congratulations to our good friends and allies in Arlington. We expect many other towns and cities to follow this spring with their own legislation. But still, our work has barely begun. Please support these articles. Thank you.
Ms. Scanlon? Scanlon.
My name is Kathleen Scanlon, town meeting member, precinct 3. So where do we go from here? Let me remind you that last year's warrant article 21 was supposed to be the easy part, the low-hanging fruit. We learned a lot by listening to each other and working through the issues to come together. With the political progress we have made together, we have opened many new doors. The narrative around fossil fuels has changed for Brookline with warrant article 21. The big takeaway is that a small town with a well-organized team can have an outsized impact. Yet even when we eventually manage to enact the original warrant article 21 into law, it's just a starting point. The harder part was always going to be how to figure out the retrofits of existing building stock and smaller renovations. And as important as these actions are tonight, the fact remains that we as a town haven't done anything yet to address the question of retrofits or even to stop installing new fossil fuel infrastructure. Nothing. Even if warrant Article 38 and 39 are passed tonight, we will enter a lengthy state legislative process before even this very first step can actually be implemented. As we hopefully celebrate tonight's vote at the end of a very long town meeting, at the same time, we need to look forward and realize that we need to do much, much more. Our next steps, once we stop installing new fossil fuel infrastructure, will require harder choices and possible financial repercussions. We must consider new local tools to reduce carbon emissions and embrace all electric technology. To do this, we will have to start afresh, as we did with warrant Article 21. We will have to work together as a town to explore the intersection of practicality, impact, and political possibility. This will include a new sustainability director. It will get harder before it gets easier. A good place for concrete action can be found in the Collins Center report issued last August. I will post it on the listserv. And this was commissioned by our town administrator. It's a welcome examination of the sustainability coordinator position and the role of the town of Brookline in addressing the crisis of climate change and sustainability. It includes achievable recommendations that can be made within Brookline's organizational structure. This will allow opportunities to leverage town resources most effectively to achieve climate priorities and balance these priorities with other community values and needs. I want to draw your attention to the 6 recommendations in the report. 1, upgrade the sustainability administrator to an assistant director position, which has already been done, and create a new sustainability planning division within the planning department. 2, develop a strategic plan built upon the foundation of the climate action plan, and the report states this should be the absolute highest priority. 3, review the role of the Select Board Climate Action Committee. 4, fully utilize the working teams organized by Zoe Lynn. 5, empower a formal standing team of town staff, department heads, and senior management to drive the sustainability agenda through the town organization. 6, review job descriptions across the town's organization to ensure that accountability for upholding the sustainability values of the community are included. The overarching recommendation of the study is for the town to view these recommendations as components of a comprehensive effort. But for tonight, let's take the next step, the very easy step. We urge you to vote favorable action on warrant Articles 38 and 39. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Heller?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Nancy Heller, speaking for a unanimous Select Board urging favorable action. These articles have prod the Massachusetts legislature to adopt measures that advance the cause of combating climate change. We've overwhelmingly supported Article 21 in last year's fall town meeting, but we were prevented by the AG from incorporating it into our bylaws. Now we ask the state to allow the measures of Article 21 to be adopted in Brookline. The request for home rule petition and the resolution of Article 38 urging the state to get on board with decarbonization are the climate change goals that town meeting has reaffirmed time and time again. Please do so again by supporting favorable action on both Article 38 and 39. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ridreo.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Carlos Figuerejo, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 14, speaking for an overwhelming majority of the Advisory Committee. First, I wanted to thank the petitioners for the very complete presentation we just heard of these 2 warrant articles. This will make my presentation a lot shorter. I would also like to commend the energy and leadership demonstrated by the petitioners, especially Mrs. Cunningham, in pushing Brookline into the forefront of decarbonization and electrification movement for our built environment. With their continued guidance, Brookline is closer each day to reaching its climate action goals of achieving zero emissions by 2050. Thank you for doing this and keeping us on track. Of these two warrant articles, I wanted to comment on Article 39, the Home Rule petition to enforce our fossil fuel-free Article 21 from last fall. This article was amended by your advisory committee as a result of careful warrant article review process. Through this process, we learned from our representation at the State House that there are three different options used to provide latitude to the state legislature in adopting a home rule petition. These options range from no modifications allowed to the text provided for the proposed legislation to the option of full modification of the proposed text as long as the scope of the legislation remains intact. Your advisory committee, in consultation with the office of our representative, Tommy Vitolo, felt this last option, which allows for greater latitude and had the greatest chances of success at the State House. The warrant article, therefore, was amended to reflect this option. Your advisory committee also urges the select board to appoint the Sustainability Review Board and establish the procedural requirements necessary for the enforcement of Article 21 before our home rule petition is enacted by Beacon Hill, so that once it happens, there are no further delays for the enforcement of the fossil fuel-free bylaw passed last fall.
1 minute.
By a unanimous vote of the advisory committee recommends favorable action of Article 38, and by a vote of 25 in favor and 1 opposed, it recommends favorable action on Article 39. On a personal note, I would like to express how fortunate we are. I cannot imagine of a better person to usher the proposed home rule petition for a cleaner environment and a better Brookline than our representative, Tommy Vitolo. We are very lucky to have him and thankful for his help in explaining how home rule petitions make their way through the State House. The warrant article review process resulted in home rule petition with a greater chances of success because of his collaboration. I'm also glad that the petitioners finally came around to realize that this amended option is better for Brookline. The process worked. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Vanderzeel. Would you unmute yourself, Ms. Vanderzeel? Click on the unmute button.
Excuse me.
There you go.
Yes. I had tried to do that and was unable to do so.
Oh, you're on now.
Okay. Yes, I know. I can see that I'm on. This is Kaya Vanderzeel, town meeting member from Precinct 15, and also a member of the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. I'm also, of course, as I told you last year, a member of the board of the Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility, and one of our main projects has to do with studying and activism around the climate change situation. I'm speaking for a unanimous Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations in support of both these warrant articles 38 and 39. I spoke before town meeting last November in favor of warrant article 21, an attempt to ban new fossil fuel infrastructure in our town via bylaw changes. As I said before, the impending climate catastrophe should be propelling us in that direction. I won't go through the rest of what I wanted to say because someone else has already said it. So I would urge you all to join the petitioner, select board, advisory committee, Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, and others, and vote favorable action on warrant articles 38 and 39.
Thank you. We have a motion for the question. I have Mr. Sainer, Mr. Lowy, and Mr. Van Scoyoc, who would speak if they were permitted to do so. And this is Article 38, 39, motion for the question. Requires a 2/3 vote. period has commenced. Voting period is Mr. Jones,
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
and the count.
187 yes, 22 no, 7 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 189 in favor, 22 opposed, and 7 abstaining. On the motion on page 38-3, the resolution calling for swift decarbonization in the Commonwealth. This is main motion, Article 38, yes. Voting period has commenced. All right, we're going to have to restart the voting period. The voting period has started. This is Article 38, main motion. Voting period is Mr. Jones,
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
and the count, please.
215 yes, 3 no, 4 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 217 in favor, 3 opposed, and 4 abstentions. Main motion on Article 39 on supplement number 1, calling for the home rule legislation. This is main motion, Article 39. Voting period has commenced. Voting period is terminated. Jones,
Jones, yes.
Ms. McNally,
McNally, yes.
count, please.
212 yes, 3 no, 4 abstentions.
Motion carries by a vote of 214 in favor, 3 opposed, and 4 abstentions. I will now entertain a motion to dissolve the fall special town meeting. Somebody make that motion, please. And is there a second? Motion has been made and seconded. This is motion to dissolve. Voting period has commenced. You only get to vote in favor of a motion to dissolve. May I have the count?
8 yes, 3 no, 3 abstentions.
Motion carries overwhelmingly. I declare the fall special town meeting dissolved. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.